Welcome back.
It's time for part 2 of the underrated N64 games list. I am rejoined by VGDad.
That's me.
As well as Professor Oak, apparently.
Hello there.
To run down our top 5. And on that note, hey VG, what are your favorite multiplayer games on the N64?
I'd say Mario Kart, Smash Bros, and GoldenEye are all top 3 for most people, taking advantage of the 4 controller ports. And of course, I also love Clay Fighter, which we covered in part 1. What about you?
Well, I actually got really into the multiplayer in Donkey Kong 64, which I also briefly mentioned already.
Wait.
And Professor Oak says I'm contractually obligated to mention Pokemon Stadium, though it wasn't my favorite. Which reminds me, did you ever want to be the very best?
Like no one ever was?
Yeah, but like, in puzzle form. One of my favorite games on the Super Nintendo was Tetris Attack, and it's a travesty that we didn't get that included on the American version of the SNES Classic, even though Japan got paneled upon on theirs, which is the game's name over there. Luckily, Pokemon Puzzle League is kind of a spiritual successor to that game, by which I mean it's literally the same game, but with a Pokemon skin instead of a Yoshi one. It's a fairly simple puzzle game. Blocks scroll up, and you flip them around to make at least 3 of a kind and clear out your panel. You can set up combos, or just get a set of 4 or more to freeze the clock briefly, and in multiplayer it also throws extra blocks onto the opponent's side. And much like other Tetris games, the longer you play, the faster the game moves. The main difference between this and Tetris Attack, as I mentioned, is the Pokemon skin. It has an impressive amount of modes, such as a single-player story mode where you have kind of a truncated journey to the Elite Four, but instead of battling gym leaders, you puzzle fight them. There's an endless mode, where you just play the game until you lose. There's the aforementioned multiplayer that you can also just play against the computer just to get some practice in. And my favorite mode from Tetris Attack also returns here in the form of a puzzle game where you have to remove all the blocks in a certain number of moves. It starts out fairly simple, but gets progressively more complicated, and can really help you get an eye for how to make incredible combos in the other game modes, so it also kind of acts as a tutorial. There's honestly not that much to really explain about the game. It's a puzzle game, you kinda just have to play it. But I love any game that has this block-flipping mechanic for clearing out the playing field. I'm not sure why. It's super thrilling in multiplayer too, as you will tap away at the controller, frantically setting up combos and then rushing to clear out the blocks dropped on you before the next wave comes, because they can really mess up your chance of survival. I will admit, though, the single-player mode isn't nearly as charming as it was in Tetris Attack, where it was basically a series of boss battles against various Yoshi enemies, as Yoshi fights to rescue his friends from Bowser. This has a more generic, you have to beat me to get the next badge plot, and that's barely interesting in an actual Pokemon game, much less when it's just multiple puzzle fights. Especially since the backgrounds don't change up much from puzzle to puzzle. The gameplay is still super solid though, and one of the best puzzle games ever created, much less just on the N64.
Well, nothing against puzzle games, but I was definitely much more into 3D platformers with puzzle elements, and I've got you covered next with another great, weird 3D platformer. Would you believe me if I told you that Rockstar North, the company best known for developing the Grand Theft Auto franchise, once made a game featuring cute animals and unique puzzle mechanics? It's true! And I'm not talking about Lemmings, which was surprisingly also developed by Rockstar North. Of course, back then they were known as DMA Design, before their acquisition by Rockstar Games, and their turn to more mature titles that flirt with controversy. I'm getting a little off track. Let's talk about Space Station Silicon Valley. The story goes something like this. In the early 21st century, Space Station Silicon Valley is launched with an entire cadre of animals. Shortly after launch, it mysteriously vanishes, believed to have disappeared forever. 1,000 years later, it reappears on a collision course with Earth, and the dynamic duo of Dan Danger and Evo, his robot pal, and your player character, are sent to investigate. Upon arrival at the space station, they discover that the animal inhabitants have merged with the station's technology, resulting in animal-machine hybrids, such as a rocket-powered fox and a mouse on wheels. The pair end up crashing on the space station, resulting in Evo being shattered into many parts, and you left in control of his microchip brain. As Evo's microchip brain, you have the ability to jump into the animal inhabitants of the space station and use their unique animal abilities to solve puzzles, complete quests, and hopefully avert disaster. Unfortunately, as a microchip, you need to find a host, otherwise you die. It's a cheap MacGuffin, but it forces you to play around in the world and find new animals. Along the way, you must also try to gather up all of Evo's missing parts, though that's not necessary to finish the game, although it is necessary to get the good ending. Spoiler, the space station is actually the machination of an evil scientist, and it's up to you to stop him. Each animal has only one or two abilities, so as not to overcomplicate things. Sometimes you can jump, sometimes you can use a short boost, and sometimes you can climb. The list goes on. And the puzzles are generally laid out in a fashion that the player can easily deduce what they have to do, but it's then up to them to figure out how to do it. See a ramp? You probably need to get the rat on wheels to boost across the gap. Huge angry bear blocking your path? Get the dog with rockets on its back to shoot the bear until it passes out. Then, hey, bonus, now you get to be a huge angry bear. In general, the controls work nicely, but you'll definitely find yourself fighting with the camera a lot, which I found to be a part and parcel with N64 games. The biggest mark against this game is that it is ugly as sin. This is pretty standard fare for the Nintendo 64, but this game has a particular eye poison quality to it. Not only that, this game came out in 1998, the same year as Banjo-Kazooie and Ocarina of Time, and those games hold up really well. Okay, relatively well. That being said, the game looks like it does, largely due to the hardware limitations, but that didn't deter the devs. In fact, the game came to be what it is, due in large part to the fact that when creating the character models, it was noted how they looked like plasticine, so they leaned into it and basically gave us, what if Wallace and Gromit took place in space 1,000 years in the future? It's the little things about this game that make it so endearing, from the offbeat British humor to the extremely fake-looking animals, to the fact that the ever-present smooth jazz soundtrack gets slightly louder when you stand next to the speakers. Basically, it's a weird game with a lot of heart.
I never played that weird game, but one that's also weird and has a lot of heart, not to mention an equally goofy title, was Beetle Adventure Racing.
Adventure Racing!
Beetle, Adventure, Racing. Those three words pretty much sum up what this game is. I don't think we really need to add any more. So, let's move on to number 2, shall we? No way, you're not getting off that easy. I love this game and want to talk about it. It might sound like a racing game spin-off of Jet Force Gemini, which admittedly would also be pretty dope, actually, but it's kind of a weird mishmash of things, combining arcadey physics car racing with an off-road find a secret passage to get hidden collectibles gameplay mechanic, and an even weirder licensing deal with Volkswagen to get it made. Yup. This was the height of the Volkswagen Beetle in the late 90s, and this game was basically a meme before memes were a thing. Nothing about it felt terribly good. The cars didn't control super well, it wasn't a very good-looking game, the selection of available cars was, well, colorful at least, and the adventure element was never fully explored. But something about it just clicked with me as a kid. I think it was that urge to find all the hidden pathways in each level and get all the points to unlock more stuff in the menu, as I was also a big fan of Tony Hawk games as a kid, and this had that similar kind of, okay, which of these walls will break when I just run straight into them satisfaction that made it less about being a good racer and more about just crashing into everything to see what happens. And I usually did that anyway in racing games. There was also a really cool variety to the courses, with everything from the basic country racetrack to a snowy lodge setting, a Hollywood-themed Jurassic Park, and more. All with routes that took you to unexpected places in an effort to adventure the crap out of these races. There are the normal variety of modes in the game too, with Grand Prix, Time Trial, etc., but there's a surprising lack of free roam to the game that I feel it could have used to just help explore the tracks to find all the secrets. Though forcing you to have to explore in a traditional race setting was most likely purposeful. It's still a bummer though, as I enjoy those elements in games like San Francisco Rush, where you're free to just learn the tracks and look for shortcuts as you drive around in practice mode. Ultimately, Beetle Adventure Racing is included because it's just so ridiculous that it even exists. When you factor in the weird licensing deal that had to happen for it, the goofy mix of racing and adventure elements, and the audacity for them to treat different colored beetles like unique cars with their own stats. But darn it, I just love it, you know? I can't help...
Can I talk about Blast Corps yet?
Jeez. I mean... yeah? I guess, go ahead. It's not like this is a two-way conversation or anything.
Okay, sit down and get ready for me to talk about the greatest game ever.
Actually, it's only number 2, so cool your jets.
Okay, well, it's number 1 in my heart. From GoldenEye and Perfect Dark to Banjo-Kazooie and Diddy Kong Racing, Rare was the king of the third party for Nintendo in the mid to late 90s. When people think of the best games on the system, those ones almost always get at least an honorable mention, if not top out the list. One game that I rarely see mentioned also happens to be one of my personal favorites, Blast Corps. It was one of the first games Rare produced for the console, which led them into having a beautiful partnership with Nintendo, leading to many critically and commercially successful titles. Rare continued to be a top producer for Nintendo up until their acquisition by Microsoft in 2002. Along with that acquisition came some less than stellar titles, but it did eventually lead to a release of Rare Replay, a compilation of some of their greatest hits over the last 30 years. Up until that point, Blast Corps fell relatively under the radar as the darling underdog of many gamers, myself included. The game came about from an idea by Rare founder Chris Stamper to have a game where you destroy buildings, and the team came up with the idea of a constantly moving object to create a sense of urgency to the proceedings. The titular Blast Corps crew is brought in to clear a safe path, as a single jolt would spell worldwide calamity. Alright, so the story isn't exactly Pulitzer level, but the game is about blowing up buildings. What do you want? Gameplay takes the form of driving through various urban and rural areas, destroying buildings and other structures that would result in the truck having a collision and the nukes exploding. The player is given a variety of different vehicles, ranging from a simple bulldozer to a 3-wheeled motorcycle that shoots concussive missiles to giant mechs. Most of them control smoothly and effortlessly, except the backlash. Fuck the backlash. Each vehicle has a unique ability, giving the player different means of destroying buildings, resulting in a wide variety of gameplay. Along with the main missions of clearing a path for the nuclear truck, each level has a secondary objective of destroying everything, freeing all the survivors, which usually comes organically from destroying everything, and collecting 100 light beacons, called RDUs. Additionally, there are side missions with different objectives, such as simple races, destroying a set amount of objectives within a time limit, and collecting all of the RDUs within a time limit. And did I mention that you go into space? Because you go into space. After clearing the main campaign and getting enough gold medals in the secondary campaign, your crew is shot to the moon to destroy a derelict moon base. Because video games. Simply put, I love Blast Corps. I could probably do an entire 20-minute video talking about just this game and the pure catharsis of blowing things up. If you haven't played it, I highly recommend it. As I mentioned before, it is on the Rare Replay compilation for the Xbox One, but for the purist, even a good quality cart will only run you about $15.
And speaking of the catharsis of blowing things up, we have made it to the number 1 spot, and blowing up that spot is a game I think you and I both agree is worthy of first place. It's Bomberman Hero.
Oh yeah, that absolutely needs to be number 1. Good call. Bomberman in general doesn't get the love it deserves.
Yeah, I mean, he finally got some recognition in Smash Bros., but they just made him a friggin' assist trophy.
Oh, it would have been great to see Bomberman as an actual fighter, and I think this game really proves he has more fleshed out moveset than just throwing bombs.
Exactly! That's why I love it so much, because most other Bomberman games are great, but feel a little too samey and are really just more focused on fun multiplayer, but this one is a full-on 3D platformer and doesn't even have multiplayer. It's super unique.
And unlike the other Bomberman game that we don't talk about, it's actually good.
Yup. So let me get on with it and explain why this game rocks for those that missed it. You'd be forgiven for not knowing which Bomberman game this is, as there was a surprising number of them on the Nintendo 64. The other games on the system are still great in their own right, and take the Bomberman formula in a more predictable route, but still evolve the franchise in great ways by having new bomb types, more complex levels, and light platforming elements. But Bomberman Hero goes a slightly different route by going full-on 3D adventure platformer. The camera is now controlled by the player, except in certain vehicle sections where it's behind the back, and Bomberman has full range of motion rather than the normal, more traditional 8-directional grid-style movement. Plus, as I mentioned before, this is an entirely single-player game, which is fairly untraditional for this series. The levels are also a lot more spread out and surprisingly vertical, as if they feel the need to prove Bomberman can hang with the big boys of platforming prowess. Though, admittedly, the imprecise floaty controls go to show that he can't, in fact, hang with them, so sorry, buddy. I still believe in our bomber friend, though, as this game just shows how much versatility the simple mechanic of throwing and kicking bombs while running and jumping around a level can have. Levels are cleverly laid out, collectibles and secret passages are cleverly hidden, and boss battles are unique and mix up the gameplay. Speaking of mixing up the gameplay, the aforementioned vehicle levels are a great way to change things up in each world, as Bomberman gets modified to swim, fly, and more in levels that feel more like a shoot-'em-up game than a Bomberman game, but still use traditional Bomberman mechanics such as power-up tiles to full effect. They're admittedly simple in practice, but compared to other Bomberman games where each level is just breaking blocks and pinning helpless enemies into corners and watching the life leave their eyes as your bomb explodes in their face, this game does so much more to provide varied gameplay than any Bomberman game before it has. And it's really just a shame that this is the only game of its kind. All future Bomberman games, even others on the N64, took more cues from Bomberman 64 instead to create a traditional experience that just gives them a few more moves and then some new bomb types. This game, alternatively, redefined what Bomberman could be, similar to Zelda jumping from Link to the Past to Ocarina of Time, and then was promptly left behind in favor of continuing the old thing. It's a shame Hudson has been so afraid to innovate their character. Well, in good ways at least. Yeah, I'm talking about you, Bomberman Act Zero. You know what you did. So, I think we made a pretty solid list this time. What do you think?
I agree, but I made the list with you, so I'm pretty biased. I'm sure the viewers will still think of something that we missed.
Oh, totally. The problem with the N64 is that most of the games are underrated, so there's plenty we haven't played either. So please, if you're watching this, let us know of any that you think should be included. I'm actually working on a list of the best underrated games that people have suggested to me on other lists I've done. All of them. So now is the chance to actually convince me to play some of the gems that you all love and I left off. And of course, I have to thank my good friend VGDad for joining me for these videos, as I couldn't have had the insight on the system without him.
Well, thanks for inviting me to join, even if you undermined my disdain for Donkey Kong 64.
I've heard it both ways. But anyway, follow us both on Twitter for stupid opinions and even stupider puns, as well as other areas of the internet to keep up on all the content you might be interested in if you've enjoyed these videos. VGDad streams regularly, which is something I've heard people really like now, and I'm always on YouTube putting out these videos every few months as I find the time to make them. Anything you want to say to end us off on, VG?
Do people still say like, comment, and subscribe? Whatever. Thanks for watching, everyone.
Bye, folks.